We do mostly parks and streetscapes and open space designs, all different sorts of public landscapes. And in October of last year, I presented at the New Mexico ASLA, New Mexico chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects, hosted a conference on pollinators in the landscape, and I talked a little bit about the challenges of incorporating pollinators and pollinator strategies into public landscapes. And I think that led to then being invited here, maybe not. But there was, Jesse was there, and so I think maybe that is continuing the dialogue that was started there. So tonight's presentation is largely about some of the opportunities and challenges and ways that we're evolving the idea of incorporating pollinators into public landscapes. So public landscapes obviously is a large landowner in a city, in an urban setting, is that our parks and streetscapes give us a really great opportunity for incorporating pollinators as well as connecting pollinators. And so there are open spaces that are not, that can provide those connections and not just be isolated. But some of the challenges that we've found with these landscapes is that there is a loss of open space, but also a loss of plant diversity. That's one of the things that working with nurserymen and working with planners and policymakers is the idea of expanding what are quote-unquote acceptable plant species in these landscapes. But then also, as I mentioned, providing corridors and connectivity to tie in with existing resources. But then we also have a really good opportunity of just doing this, is kind of preaching to the choir a little bit, but expanding the awareness and educational opportunities that we have in public landscapes. So I'll show you some of the things that we do with some of that. So these are the kinds of things that we do. Public buildings and plazas. So on the upper left is Santa Fe Plaza. On the right is things like the Isotope Stadium. So it's kind of everything in between. Before, landscape architects, let me ask, who is familiar with landscape architecture? Do you know landscape architects? Okay, so as landscape architects, we're used to really focus on all kinds of things like accessibility, and irrigation, and grading and drainage, and hydrology and soils and psychology and sociology and all these other ologies. One of the last things that was ever considered, if it was considered, was pollinators. So largely landscape architects regarded plant material as aesthetic. Maybe it was something that provided some windbreak, some shade, but pollinators was a low priority. And when pollinators were discussed, usually it was with regard to a butterfly garden, where the butterflies were aesthetic. It wasn't as doing a job, it wasn't doing something. And pollinators were often regarded as a threat, particularly in schools or parks, where people got really afraid of a bee sting. And so we were actually, for quite a time, designing bee-friendly plants out of public landscapes because they were seen as a threat. But then that led to, a few years ago, really a much broader awareness of not only an opportunity, but of a crisis of pollinators in public landscapes. And so that really tipped the scales to where instead of being an afterthought or something that was specifically designed out of a project, that they became a real integral part of what we were doing. And we saw some of the opportunities with open spaces, ecological restoration. This is a big ranch up in northern New Mexico that we worked on a lot of reclamation and restoration. But then transportation corridors that provided links in those corridors. Then this is another big thing that we do. We do a lot of parks and streetscapes. My firm did the Big I. We do a lot of the medians around in town. And we do an awful lot of parks for the city of Albuquerque as well. And as we stepped back, we said, well, what we've been doing has been a little bit there, and we can retroactively go back and say these are all the great ways that we had addressed pollinators, but they were all happenstance if they happened. They weren't something that was necessarily planned. So this is the goal. This is when we look at an evolution towards more naturalistic landscapes, in particularly landscapes that are more pollinator friendly, we start to look at this. And this was that same ranch that I mentioned before. This is a little orchard grove with Rotipida that's growing underneath, Mexican hat. This was a park, it was a privately owned ranch. And the ranch owner were not allowed by non-disclosure agreement to say who owns the ranch, but they were really into promoting, and they wanted to have a very vibrant orchard. And so they had this whole design system of ground covers, forage, nectar producers that provided for the pollinators for the orchard. But then this is high desert. This is another example. This was kind of a leading edge design. This was actually not my design. Another landscape architecture firm in Albuquerque did this. But this was one of the first dabbles into the notion that something could be different, that we could have a more naturalistic landscape, and that was actually a desirable an outcome. But these are the challenges. This is what we live with. This is Albuquerque Academy campus in the Northeast Heights, and I took that picture because that shows generally what we could expect Albuquerque to look like if we didn't build Albuquerque here. And we can know what it will look like. You can drive north to Sandia or south to Isleta, and you can generally see what the Albuquerque ecosystem would be. And what strikes me of this, I also use this, I presented to the Think Trees conference in Albuquerque, and I say that's an example of our native trees. And that shows you an example of the biodiversity that we have. So that's a struggle. New Mexico, there are definitely places that are more vibrant, there's opportunities, but the natural landscape, and it's raining today, but generally we're pretty challenged. This is up in Chimayo, and that shows the vibrancy of life when we've had 6 months of drought. You walk on that landscape and it crunches underneath your feet. But there are other challenges, largely with people. And so this is another photo of Santa Fe Plaza. We did the renovation of the plaza about 10 years ago or so. And there was talk about potentially looking at flowering plants, but it's really heavily used. Just gets hammered with people all the time. It's just completely crawling with people. But then there are also the perceptions that come along with people. And when we look back at when we look at this more naturalistic landscape, you say, you look at these others, this is up by Academy, Wyoming area. And this is typically what, for a long time, we got with public landscapes, with medians. That's a catnip, an epida, that does a pretty good job of attracting bees, but not in that setting. It's a terrible setting. And I don't know if you can tell the orange that's kind of around here, that's the herbicide that's sprayed around to maintain a very isolated image of what a public landscape would be. We'll talk about how we're kind of stretching the limits of that. Well, we also, when we're looking at parks, you have something like this. This is Robinson Park in downtown Albuquerque. And Robinson Park on the weekends is filled up with that, with the public, with the growers market. A really vibrant growers market that completely packs it. And we had again talked about strategies for having more shrubs. It's hard to tell in this photo, but that's it. There are about 8 shrubs in here, little decorative roses. That was it, because that's the pressure that gets put onto that landscape on a regular basis. So we've had little dabbles of trying. We've had little opportunities to say we're going to try to create something that's a little bit different. So this was a project that we worked on probably about 5 years ago. And we teamed with Judith Phillips. Anybody know Judith Phillips? Fantastic. Oh, she's a fantastic landscape designer. And knows more about this stuff, has forgotten more about this stuff than I'll ever know. But we got to work with her on this. It's the El Oso Grande pollinator habitat. And this was funded by a P&M grant. The local Master Gardeners Club had gotten the funding and wanted to build this pollinator habitat in an existing park property at the city of Albuquerque. The reason that we got involved was the city said, we don't want anything to do with it. They said, we can't maintain it. We don't want to maintain it. We tried this in the past. It's going to die. We said, no, it's going to be fine. So we designed an irrigation system. that followed City of Albuquerque standards for equipment, but it was a little bit different. It was a drip irrigation system, which usually the city doesn't particularly follow drip because it's very maintenance intensive. So we said, okay, the master gardeners said, that's okay, we will maintain it. And they signed something, or just verbally agreed, but they say, we will maintain it. So the city said, okay, well, if it dies, we're not going to replace it, you maintain it, you do everything with it. So we put it in, and it looked really great, and then that was 2 weeks ago. Oh. Rabbits, irrigation didn't work for a while. You can see here that exclosures to keep rabbits away from plants. What we learned from that project was that plants don't really like to live in cages like that. They don't like to live, and this has been a drought for 6 months. So it was really hard. Anything that had maybe started to germinate got trampled, got eaten. And unfortunately, this gives a public parks maintenance department ammunition to say, we told you so. So what we've been working on is sneaky strategies for how to get around something like this, or how to know that that's the conditions that we're dealing with. So this is another park that's on the west side. Anybody ever see this? It's called Petroglyph Estates Park. It's in a new development that's right above the petroglyphs, called Petroglyph Estates. This was a park that when we started designing this, the city said no grass. It's in a detention basin that's going to get flooded. We don't want a blade of turf grass out there. And so we said, okay, well, let's sort of hyper juice it up and have it be a pollinator garden, have it be an explorative garden. It's right above the petroglyphs. So we had interpretive signage and ways that you could find petroglyphs that weren't they were modern petroglyphs. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And the city said, okay. So we tried a bunch of things and learned from something like this to where we don't have isolated irrigation. We also don't have plant exclosures. If you get eaten by a rabbit, then something else will fill its place that won't get eaten by rabbits. And we'll seed. And we'll irrigate, broadcast irrigate, spray irrigate, so that we're covering a large area of soil and not having one little dripper in a plate. And so things will naturally evolve. And this was just a couple weeks ago, and you can see where here there's some penstemons growing sort of out of an Apache plume that's right here. And this was a way that the penstemons blew in. We didn't plant the penstemons, they just kind of blew in and started growing because they found some water and a little bit of shade. We also, you can see here, have native grasses and wildflower seeds that were sprinkled in, and they don't look typically like what people expected from a park. You can see here we also did large hobble that held seed and held water, and so you can see that this is a new paradigm of a park. But you also see these here. I'll get to those in a second. Well, I'll come back. Those signs that's what the sign says. That's our little petroglyphs. You can see our little steel-cut butterfly here. So, the notion was if we didn't succeed in attracting pollinators, we'll actually have steel pollinators out there. A lot have been stolen, unfortunately, but they're still there. But what this sign says, you can't read it, but it says evolution of plant communities. So what we knew was going to happen out there were things were going to die and things were going to replace them. And so what we did is we put a plan of what was originally planted and designed, with photographs of what those things look like. And then in this description we say, it won't look like this. It will change. Things will die, other things will come in. And it was almost, it's, for lack of a better term, a hide and go seek, or a go find me kind of a thing of see what's out there and compare it to what we designed. But what this really actually served as, so it's educational, but what it served was a get-out-of-jail-free card for the maintenance guys. Is that we gave them permission to fail in the sense of a typical park maintenance. That they could let something die that was okay. Let it die. If it wasn't meant to be there, it's going to die. Something else will go in its place. And so that allowed them to accept an aesthetic that looked like that. We also learned that we weren't always talking about honeybees. We weren't always talking about butterflies. That we were dealing with little guys like this, little native bees that live in the ground, that live in the dirt, that want wet, sandy soil that they can burrow into. And so this is because that whole park acts as a drainage basin, this is the low-flow drainage basin, and it collects sand in it. It's on the west side. The sand flows in or erodes into it, so that's okay. They started cleaning this out, and we said, that's all right, leave it. Because that now fills up with little tiny ponds of water. And so those little tiny ponds of water become a water source for the native bees that are out there. And so we've learned, instead of strategies like this, of trying to isolate and try to keep everything maintained, is that let them go. And we gave the Parks Department permission to let it. But talking about education at other levels, you see this is Albuquerque Academy, but I know a lot of middle schools, a lot of elementary schools, high schools. I would assume that Bosque School has these educational opportunities where they have clubs that get together. This is a club at Academy that comes out and maintains the insect habitat, drill holes in these, and they're promoting. But again, this is what Albuquerque Academy campus looks like. So this is a very isolated case. So the challenge is to have a landscape like this that's replicable, to be able to have something like that. This is a very small plot. This is probably about the size of the corner of this room. So the idea is, how can this be something that becomes much broader of a plot? We're also working really closely with the city on accepting. So this is a typical park. This is called Montgomery Park. And there was a long time a very big anti-white clover movement. That white clover was a weed. That white clover, again, could be a danger to somebody who was allergic to bees because it attracted bees. But it also didn't stand up to soccer cleats very well. And so the city would come in and would spray white clover with broadleaf herbicide. And through an educational process, and through groups like this, actually, groups got together with the city and said, as we're going to adopt the city as a bee-friendly city, is that's one of the biggest nectar producers in the city, in the urban environment, is white clover. And so if it's there, if you don't got to do anything to it, in fact, if you got to pay a lot of money to do something about it, then just leave it. It's okay. Except that it's going to be a little bit of a different aesthetic. And then adapting. This was, I take zero credit for this, but I drove by and it was thrilled. These are medians on Lomas downtown, so you can see the courthouse here. And for a long time they've looked like that. Because they were designed as fairly typical landscape medians that were tough to maintain. They were a busy street, they were elevated, so it was tough to get in. And the irrigation system kind of failed, didn't get fixed, and so they look like that. And I drove by a couple weeks ago. If you haven't been by there, go by there. It's really cool. It was planted and irrigated and intended. I think these are gaillardias that were planted and allowed to grow just like that. And so this to me was seeing the city adapt. Instead of planting or spraying herbicide in the medians, they specifically planted it to look like that. And it was a really eye-opening, like, hooray, that's the way we're talking about it. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's our office is right on not many levels. And then there's developing patience. So this is a project on UNM campus. It's the UNM College of Education building. And this was a LEED Platinum building. Anybody know the LEED rating system for buildings? It's a sustainable rating system for buildings, low energy use. So